Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening at Windows on Collections Protest. My name is Tony Burton. I'm the Collection Curation and Engagement Manager here at the State Library Victoria. On behalf of State Library Victoria, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional lands of all the Victorian Aboriginal clans and their cultural practices and knowledge systems. We recognise that our collections hold traditional cultural knowledge belonging to Indigenous communities in Victoria and around the country. We support communities to protect the integrity of this information gathered from their ancestors in the colonial period. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, who have handed down these systems of practice to each new generation for millennia. So to tonight's event. So from the steps on the forecourt to the depths of the collection, this library, State Library Victoria, plays a vital role in how Victoria protests. For over 150 years, the library has been a community meeting point for equal rights, representation and justice campaigns, and continues to provide a platform for voices to be heard. Our collections hold a diverse range of material relating to protest, activism, dissent and free speech, and we actively add to these collections today through donations and purchased acquisitions. Tonight we are joined by three artists whose work captures stories of urban protest and social movement in Melbourne. We have Julie Shiels. Julie is the creator of the Grandmasters political parodies series that have been seen, and you may have seen, on walls across the city, online, in a book, and on placards at the recent March for Justice rallies. Maylei Hunt created the Let's Eat Cake photography series, documenting the journey to marriage equality in Australia. And Alistair Mckeech photographed Black Lives Matters and Invasion Day protests. All of this material we hold in our collection here. So thank you very much for joining us tonight, Julie, Maylei and Ali. Each of our three speakers will be delivering a short presentation about their work, some of which is on display here this evening, and you'll get an opportunity to speak to my colleagues Sarah and Greg about that later. And following these presentations, we'll bring these speakers together for a short discussion. So before we hear from our first speaker, a few quick housekeeping notes. So if you haven't done already, please switch your mobile phones to silent, so not to be interrupted. You'll find the toilets if you walk back out through Hanson Hall, from which you came, and around to your left near the marble staircases. There'll be people on hand to show you as well if you need guidance. And following the presentations and discussion, we will again invite you to explore some of our collections, which my colleagues Greg Durand and Sarah Ryan have kindly brought out for us. The speakers also have their own books available for purchase at the end of the night, if you'd like to do so. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Maylei Hunt is a photographer and filmmaker based in Melbourne, whose career spans over 21 years in the social documentary, commercial and art spectrum of photography. Maylei is deeply passionate about social justice, the community and the arts, and combining personal passions of the arts and community engagement to create unique works and creative opportunities with a strong focus on storytelling. With a documentary shooting style and focus, Maylei is interested in the amazing stories that we all have and the importance of being the authors of our own histories. Maylei's works are in many collections, both private and public, and these include here at the State Library of Victoria, but also State Library of New South Wales, University of Technology Collection, and the Murray Art Museum. So I'd like to welcome Maylei to the stage. Thank you.
Good evening. I will start with an acknowledgement that we are all on the unceded lands that we stand on, live in, work in and play on, and pay my respects to First Nations elders and people of the Kulin Nation, past, present and emerging. I'd also would like to acknowledge the many social justice warriors, community leaders and the many in the community who have fought and are still fighting for the many social inequalities we have in our country. The fight is not over. I would like to also say a sincere thanks to the amazing team at the State Library of Victoria for hosting this event. I think it's a really important time to consider and reflect on protest, considering we haven't protested for quite a number of years. And I would like to also thank the library for believing in the importance of collecting these historical images, because it shows our resistance and the community's demand for more justice and equality by the people of Australia. So I'd like to start with the quote, if I may. Okay. No one is free till we are all free. A quote from Dr. Martin Luther King. So evening, my name is Maylei Hunt, and I'm very much honoured to share with you tonight my story and my passion for photography and social justice in Australia. I'm a proud third-generation Australian-born Chinese whose roots are based in the southern province of Guangzhou, and I was brought up in the Darug lands in Western Sydney and now reside in Naarm, Melbourne. I'm a social documentary photographer, media creative, and I'm passionate about social justice, equity, and storytelling. Social documentary photography is to record history of the lives and communities that we are part of, to bring forward the stories that are not in the mainstream media. Our stories are important, valid, and are a large part of the tapestry of the Australian history, and we are part of history every day. This body of work is one of many protests that I participate in and are passionate about. There are many social issues in Australia that needs to be addressed, and we need to have a long-term vision for change in the laws and to change the structures of inequality in Australia. I would like to acknowledge the importance of today, being the 4th of May. It's a day of resistance and protest. May we remember we stand on the shoulders of the many social justice warriors who fought for the rights and safety for all. There is so much inequality to fight for in terms of First Nations, refugees, housing affordability, domestic violence, safety in the workplace, in workplaces and community, and also climate change. And it starts with the issues being taken seriously, where laws are changed for the better and for the future government policies to be visionary and long-term. As I mentioned, historically, the month of May is a time of resistance. Just wanted to give, I guess, some context before I show you my work as well. And it was very interesting to research this myself. So the 1st of May is actually Labor Day, and historically, it's a really significant day, being the 1st of May in Chicago in 1886. In America, the Haymarket Affair. This was a street protest for the 8-hour day. And it was actually initially inspired by the Australian movement that was earlier in 1856, where there was a strike and a stoppage as well. So this is now globally known as May Day, or the International Workers' Day. And in New York in 1912, on this day, the Suffrage Parade occurred. We had 20,000 majority women and some men who participated, and they were protesting to have equal rights to vote. And actually, interestingly, just a side note as well, in Australia, women were able to vote in South Australia in 1894, obviously earlier. Interestingly as well, in China on the 4th of May in 1919, there is a very significant day in China called the May 4th movement. This was a protest of 3,000 students from universities and colleges in Beijing in front of Tiananmen Gate. And the protests were to demand the government at the time not to sign the Treaty of the Paris Peace Conference at the end of World War I. If this treaty was signed, it was actually signing off that Chinese lands of the Shandong province that were owned by Germany at the time would be given to Japan, which would then allow Japan to be to move into key strategic areas in China. So understandably, at the time, the people of China were really quite worried, concerned, and they wanted their sovereignty to be protected at the time. Now, just quickly with a couple other things that happened. On the 4th of May in Washington, there was the first freedom riders as well, which is actually quite interesting. So they were, at the time, protesting and giving voice about the racial segregation. This also inspired the Australian Freedom Ride as well, which was also headed by Charlie Perkins at the time. Now, just more recently, on the 4th of May as well, 1992, in Los Angeles, there was the Rodney King riots, and riots, as we know, erupted in the LA streets after the announcement of the jury acquittal for the 4 police officers who used excessive force to arrest and beat up Rodney King. And just recently, in May in 2020, we saw George Floyd as well. So another very tragic incident where police, we witnessed, unfortunately, the killing of a person of colour by police at the time. So again, this before COVID ignited in Australia as well. Our Black Lives Matters protests in 2020 as well, which I think is well overdue in terms of justice for First Nations people. So in terms of my journey in documentary photography, it first started with my interest in, obviously, photography and history. I was at art college at the time in the 1990s, and I discovered works by William Yang and Nan Goldin. These were great artists who documented their lives at the time and their time in the city as well. So I too, as a young person, documented my life, and protesting was also part of my story. So the very first march that I went to in Sydney was in the 2000s, and this is one of the photographs that I had photographed, and it was a march for peace during the Iraq. We were protesting against the Iraq War. So it's something that was, obviously, I felt quite strongly about. I talked to friends and were invited by university friends to come along, and felt really inspired collectively with friends and colleagues, and of course I had my camera at hand, so always being very present that way. Now, I remember an interesting dinner conversation that I had with my family about protesting in Australia. They said to me, what difference will you make? You're just one person, Maylei. You're a drop in the ocean. They couldn't see the potential for change, and they had lost hope that we could collectively. This didn't dishearten me. At the time, there was, and even now, an urgency to protest for many injustices in the world. I went to support many causes that I was passionate about, and one such cause was the marriage equality for LGBTI people. This was a very topic that's close to my heart as well, and so my journey of marching together was in 2009, and in Sydney, So I took to the streets every year, taking lots of photographs, participating, getting involved. And what was great is that over time, every year the marches got bigger and bigger. So by 2016, when I moved to Melbourne, I was fortunate to come along to the Equal Love marches that were amazingly run by the Equal Love team, and I'd like to acknowledge the team that's here today. And over the last, from 2016 to 17, there's been very intense street marches, and it's been wonderful to see the number of our colleagues, of our friends, of our community coming out to support and help us with the plebiscite yes move. So I'm very honoured that I guess in terms of my documentation, I was always hopeful that we would see change, and possibly I was like hopeful it might happen in my lifetime. And so I'm very honoured to say that it did happen in our lifetime, and I was very honoured to be present to see all the different stages of our plebiscite. So here, this is a picture of the plebiscite before the announcement. As you can see, we're all quite nervous. It was probably the most nervous day that I've had. Here, out on the steps of the State Library. It was a very quiet morning, and was very interesting. And so obviously, once the announcement was made, it was quite electric, almost deafening, actually. So I'm in right at the front of the crowd, and I was covered in champagne and powder, but was very excited because the feeling was so exuberant and so joyful. And also, in some cases, people were quite tearful as well. So I was very fortunate to witness, but also just, feel history and be part of that history as well. So it was a very emotional time for our community, and I'd like to acknowledge that today. It may still be quite emotional for all of us, but I would like to acknowledge that still is present. Sorry, I've just lost my spot. Yes. So the marriage equality journey is a really clear example of the capacity of collective power of protest, and that we are, yes, mere drops in the ocean, but we can make change for a better world. Before COVID, I have to admit we were protesting quite a lot. I would say probably every month I was protesting on the streets. We were all protesting on the streets for climate change, for First Nations, for women's safety, many things we were protesting. And these issues are still relevant to us today. So I would like to lastly encourage you all to take up a baton without fear, to make noise, and let's keep the fight up. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much for that, Maylei. That was just really engaging. And actually, I was thinking while I was sitting there going, I remember exactly where I was when the announcement was made about marriage equality, and I remember the emotion in some of my I was at work, some of my colleagues' faces, the relief, the joy, and then also so really strong emotions. So it brought that feeling back to me. So thank you. Our next speaker is Alistair Mckeech. So Ali is former touring musician and producer, a criminology photographer, writer and lecturer. Ali regularly travels internationally to conduct projects based on politics, social issues and culture, and has also worked extensively with Indigenous communities in Australia. His recent projects include Rohingya refugees, Kazi stone labourers in India, marginalised groups in East Timor, and street photography in Iran. His portrait of the Indigenous singer and songwriter Archie Roach was selected in the 2021 Bonus Photography Prize, and the State Library of Victoria recently acquired a collection of Ali's protest photography. Ali is also the author of the full-length travel book The Eyeball End, and has recently completed and launched his second book and the photozine Analog Iran. So welcome, Ali. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. My name's Ali, otherwise known as Alistair to pretty much no one except my mother, and tonight, Tony. Oh, how many? Is there quite a few more to go through? Keep clicking? Oh, okay, right. There we go. Okay, sorry, guys. So yes, my name is Ali. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and thanks for the State Library for inviting me and for including some of the photography that I've done over the years in the collection. And it's a fantastic space to have these photographs, particularly as if you've been involved in protests, we know that they often occur right here outside the front of the State Library. Often it's like the default place to go and hold a protest. And so firstly, also I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Kulin Nations, the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people, and I pay respects to First Nations people all around the continent now known as Australia on Western maps. And I also would like to just acknowledge that although my photographs tonight that I'm talking about are of Invasion Aid protests and Black Lives Matter protests, there's two things I want to say about that. One is that it's my personal belief that people from those communities are the best people to tell those stories. I just happen to be a passionate ally that was there and took a whole bunch of photos, and so these are them. And then secondly, that this is, for me, my personal contribution is just a tiny little speck on a long history of First Nations resistance ever since 1788, and that whilst I'm happy to be able to talk about my own personal contribution to that, it's certainly just a tiny fraction of what has been going on for over 200 years, and I really want to acknowledge that. As such, my talk will be more really about, as a photographer, not so much as the social history, and I really want to thank Maylei for talking about May the 4th. There's a bunch of stuff in there that I didn't know about. So yeah, as mentioned, I'll be talking about some of the photography that I just really happen to be on the spot for some of the protests that have been going on, and as I'm continuing to do as a photographer and journalist as well. So part of my role is I teach law and criminology at Victoria University. I also write and photograph for Al Jazeera, and as a photojournalist. And for me, when I was younger, being a photojournalist was kind of like being an astronaut. Like, you know they're there and that someone has that job, but how do you actually do that? How do you get into space? And so if you're an older person or passionate about reading and researching photojournalism, you'll know, there's these fantastic images that have really changed the course of history, for example, from the Vietnam War and so on. And so looking at those when I was younger in my parents' books, I was always like, how did you do that? How did you go and kind of become a photojournalist and capture parts of history? And so really what I just decided to do was I was just going to go out and do it. This particular story is about, was an extensive series that I did on homelessness in Melbourne for Al Jazeera, and was photography based and centred around the stories of lived experience, such as Scotty, who you can see here, who spent many years on the streets. I also, Tony mentioned the intro, did a series on the Rohingya refugee crisis, and you may have heard of this coming into the media in around August 2017. I was in Myanmar and southern Bangladesh in early 2016. So this was at a very strange period in time where for some reason the Myanmar government actually gave me a written permission to go into the Rohingya refugee camps and IDP concentration camps in Myanmar and take photographs of people, which is pretty much not going to happen for a very long time, at least in the Myanmar side. You can go on the Bangladeshi side. So again, this was just something that I was passionate about. I wasn't sponsored to do this. I had no funding. I really just went and did it. I'd been to Myanmar a few times already, and I was able to complete this with the assistance of a Burmese friend of mine who really put his life on the line to make this happen. And then it came out. We photographed them. Everyone was like, the Rohingya who? And then 2017 happened, and then suddenly these photographs were a very valuable source because Myanmar government shut the border. They weren't allowing anyone into that area, and now it's almost impossible even to get into the country. In fact, all the journalists have fled. So we're talking about the power of photography and why it's important, and Maylei already mentioned this. This is precisely why, because we've documented these stories and we've gone in and we've photographed some of the people who are at the mercy of brutal governments such as the Myanmar government. Just very quickly, other projects, the most recent one that I did was in Iran, which I literally just launched a photo book last week, which you can come and have a look at over the table. This is really just street photography from around Iran. I shot on black and white film. The previous photo was on medium format film. That's, as a photographer, my preference is to shoot in film, although, Al Jazeera, I've stuck a few film photos through to them and they haven't noticed and they've been published, but generally speaking, they want digital photos. So my involvement with First Nations communities has been since I was a child, actually, and my father worked with Aboriginal communities in Western Australia. And so I've kind of really just been brought up around that and had a deep interest in what's going on with First Nations histories and social injustice, hence my involvement with law and the Aboriginal Legal Service for many years. So this particular photo is, people may recognise, Uncle Archie Roach. And so this was for a shoot that we were doing for the Koori Mail, actually, the Indigenous run newspaper. And this one I shot on an old 1949 Rolleiflex box camera, one of the ones that you look down into the mirror. And so again, that's just my preference, is I find medium format film and analog photography really captures something that's a little bit more, I don't know, there's more of an aesthetic to it than what I find with digital. So now let's getting on to the collection, some of the photos that are in the collection here, of which there's a couple that you can view. Kind of similar to Maylei, I just started going to the protests because I was passionate and I know a lot of the organisers and the speakers and the people involved, and really just started shooting just out of my own interest and wanting to do this. This is another one that's on black and white film, and it's from 2019. So, one of the earlier Invasion Day protests in terms of what was happening in Naarm at that time. These protests have been going on for many years, but in terms of what was happening here in Naarm with regards to, for example, the Warriors of the Aboriginal Resistance. Interestingly, talking about the history, the first Invasion Day style protest was I think it was in 1938 in Sydney. So this has been going on a long time as well. Again, these photos and my involvement is really just a small speck in this. A few other photos I'll just quickly go through because we've got another great speaker coming up. So these ones, I kind of wanted to really capture in this particular photo, the signs and what people were bringing to the protests and what people's thoughts are and the sentiment. This one was at 2020 Invasion Day protest. And then we also saw in around June, after the George Floyd incident, the Black Lives Matter protests were organised here in Naarm as well. And so the next couple of shots are just from that. And what was really interesting, speaking with the organisers after the protest, was just how many more people actually showed up to that particular protest as there had been prior with the Sovereign Nations Invasion Day protests. And it was obviously that international coverage and sentiment that had burst onto the global the global social movement scene, the social justice scene, that really impacted here and really highlighted also, of course, what was going on with black deaths in custody here in so-called Australia. And as a teacher at Victoria University in law, I noticed a massive shift in students' attitudes towards things like black deaths in custody, in terms of being a lot more firstly knowledgeable, willing and open to learn about it, and also aware of what was going on here in so-called Australia. So again, if we're talking about the power not only of photography but of protests, for myself personally, I've seen a massive shift in the younger cohort that I teach at the law school, which is great to see. This one is another one from Black Lives Matter. These are shot on digital, but with a manual lens for anyone who's interested in photography. I prefer manual lenses, fixed lenses, so no zooms, so that way you have to actually if you want to zoom in, you have to walk up to the people and get close. I find that for me, rather than sitting back with a big telephoto lens, that engages me more with the people around me. It also puts me in an ethical dilemma because people notice that I'm going to take their photo and I have to engage with them and make sure that's okay, and those types of things, rather than sitting back 50 meters away, like zooming in on people. That's just my preference. Other photographers are, of course, different. This one's from Invasion Day 2021, and this is Uncle Bill Hunter. And so part of what I try and do with the photography is capturing the energy as well as the people. So you're trying to document, for me at least, I'm trying to document not just the event itself, but what's the energy, what's the mood, what are people bringing to it, what are people trying to say, hence, the signs, and what I guess the overall vibe of a particular protest or event is. Similar to this one, I feel like there's a bit of energy captured, and also again, for photographers here, if you get on a lower vantage point, it kind of creates, it's called the hero perspective. It gives like power and authority to the people that are in your photographs. So it's one of the challenges, I think, if you've been involved in protest photography, and I was shooting some the other night at MITA, the refugee transit accommodation, when the police came and this kind of thing, is how do you photograph, compose, use a manual lens while things are getting a bit hectic and crazy around you. And so that's one of the challenges, but I think that's also part of the skill, I guess, and we see this on display with many photographers in capturing that energy and movement. Again, this is just another shot from that 2021 Invasion Day protest. This one, just trying to get an angle down just to see from a different perspective. Personally, as a photographer, I like, finding different perspectives. How can we find a different way to view an image or to convey and communicate an idea or a sentiment or what's happening? And so, again, this is obviously from low down. So if anyone's interested in photography, wants to learn more, come and have a chat after the presentation. This last couple are from some of the refugee protests that were occurring outside the Park Prison in Carlton, in which many people who'd been medevaced from Manus Island had been interned for a long time. So not only did people have to spend 6, 7, 8, 9 years on Manus Island, and that brutality, were then medevaced to Melbourne and put into rooms in hotels in suburban Melbourne. So this was the one that I was speaking of previously, where there was altercation between the protesters and the police. I was in the middle of it, again with a manual 35mm lens, just doing my best to try and shoot what was going on. And this one is also from that same protest. And again, I think with, speaking from a photographic perspective, trying to get nice lighting, composition, plus energy and mood is one of the goals that I actually have as a photographer, as well as conveying what the subject is about and the social justice issue that people are protesting about at the time. And so that's my goal, is to continue to do this type of work, and hopefully, like Maylei and others, continue to put these images forward, not only to capture the historical aspect of it, but also the issue and make some kind of change the best we can. Thanks everyone for having listened, and enjoy the rest of the night.
Thanks, Ali, so much for that. It was great to hear about how you kind of inserted yourself in the space to capture the images in the way to really try and capture the essence and get up close and personal to some of the people and the topics that were being raised. Our final speaker is Julie Shiels. Julie started her art career as a screen printer and political poster maker and founded Planet Posters. She subsequently worked collaboratively with culturally diverse communities, museums and art organisations on mixed media projects concerned with inequality and social change. Julie holds a PhD from the Victorian College of the Arts and taught in the RMIT School of Art for more than a decade. Julie regularly exhibits in public galleries and artist-run spaces and has undertaken many temporary and permanent public art commissions. Her work is held in many public collections, including the National Gallery of Australia, Geelong Gallery, and of course here at the State Library of Victoria. So I'd like to welcome Julie to the stage. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you for having me here tonight and making the extra effort of. Am I talking into the microphone enough? It's probably because I'm newer. It seems to be a bit intermittent. Okay, is this one better? Oh, terrific. Well, thank you for getting me here tonight. This little setup in the wheelchair wasn't intended. I'm going to need to get a sound check on this. Is this sounding okay now? It is. It's not sounding okay to me. So was it sounding okay? Right, yeah. It might be because I'm sitting or something like that. Yes, you know that it's not the person operating the microphone. Well, anyway, thank you for getting me here. This wasn't my plan, and so I'm very pleased to be sitting, I think, comfortably on the stage without any fear of falling off. And now that I'm here, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Boon Wurrung and Woiwurrung and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. No, still. I mean, can people hear me? Because I'm quite happy to just throw my voice. So I'm still on somebody else's opposite direction. Oh, the arrows have been knocked off. Okay, terrific. My project is quite different to the others in that it just generated itself, and needless to say is very much to do with protest. It came about because I was overwhelmed with despair and anger. I'd say rage, actually, at the behaviours of the federal government. And I'd been doing a lot of climate change activism, and a lot of the work that I was doing meant I had to be really polite as a police liaison person and so on. I won't go into the details of that. And so I was always biting my tongue, and so I decided I needed an outlet for that, and so I started working with old masters paintings because I thought that that provided us with a context of how previous societies expressed resistance, I suppose, and often in quite covert ways. So political commentary has been and critique has been the realm of fine art, and it was done through allegory, myth, and history, social history as well. So what I did was I quite simply just started putting politicians' heads together with the paintings. I'm not going to use that if that's okay. So this, it's working down here, is it? Okay, I'll hold it down there. So my presentation, I decided to call Overcoming Political Fatigue because the purpose of it was to basically create images that are really easy to consume and hopefully hard to forget, and also overcome people's feeling of despair and impetus, my impotence, that word, but also to keep the behaviours right out there. And I decided that I'd just pick on the federal government because they're the ones that were in power. And also in the tradition of the grandmasters, if there was any parodies, it was always about people in power. So people have said to me, well, why didn't I do X, Y, and Z? Why didn't I do the state government? Why was it the federal government? It's because they're in power. And so I started off just doing it online because we were in lockdown and there was nowhere else to do it. And so I had it as an Instagram account and also on Facebook. Then when we came out of lockdown for the women's rally, I turned the pictures into prints and put them in gold frames, and some friends, we became our own little gallery. I then did some paste-ups, and then I did a couple of books. So it just sort of one thing led to the other. So this is just a little example of some of them on Instagram, just the spread of some early ones. And I suppose the way it worked is that, I mean, they just kept on saying outrageous things. And quite often, and people would just say, did they really say that? And I can assure you they did, because I always made sure that I either searched Hansard if it was said in Parliament, or made sure that it was a credible newspaper or media service. So yes, they did. They absolutely said it. And so what it slowly built up was this kind of resistance, a small resistance, a quiet resistance of, 1,000 or so followers online, and I think I posted about 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes more, sometimes less. Generally, something would just bug me so much. I didn't always plan to do work, but something would be like it got up my bum, and then I just had to find a painting to go with the quote. So basically, it tracks all of the rather ghastly acts that, in my view, the government made, and certainly with the people that were engaged with the project. I mean, this one's a killer. And I really like the fact that he's got a sausage made out of a dog. That's the animal spirits. So I was actually really careful to make sure that the paintings matched very well. Like if the narrative of the painting didn't coincide with the quote, then I left it alone. Like they do align very well, and as political parodies, they do work and support. The quote and the picture do support each other. A lot of time fiddling around on Photoshop, which I'm not very good at, but I got much better. So I basically just responded to all of the problems and dreadful holes that there was in the government commentary and their lack of leadership. So this is just a very small number of them off the online. And then this is one of the final ones that I did. I started developing ones that were like rebuttals. So the politician would say something appalling, and then I gave voice to somebody who rebutted it, so a pushback. And in that series, there's a lot more of those. Some of them work better than others, because part of the way they work is to be gritty and a bit dreadful. And so some of the pushbacks can seem a bit lame. And so I tried to keep it. My decisions were always, somebody said to me years ago when I was making posters, you want to make a poster with a statement, when somebody looks at it, they find it hard to forget they've seen it. And the thing is that with a 24-hour news cycle, it's very hard to hold people's attention. And I am by no means viral, but like the project did reach quite a lot of people. And then, as I said, we decided to hit the streets with it, and that was a fabulous experience. We just didn't even get to the march. People just kept on taking a photo. And so we just ended up deciding to be a bit like you know, an outdoor art show. And that's when we did get to the grass. And so it sort of felt like the work really travelled through people's social media engagement. These ones are quite famous, obviously, those comments, that is. If I'm going too fast, I was actually, I had it all, I was all planned to do the next March for Justice, but then that happened. So then after another lockdown, I do pay stubs, but I make sure they're always legal, they're always with permission. So some friends had a renovation. It's really nice when you have quite wealthy friends, and they let me paste up. And it was fabulous. It was really very exciting and was getting a lot of good feedback. And then somebody came along and protested themselves. They thought it shouldn't be there. And so it was slowly being ripped down. And then I think in the first lockdown last year, the whole thing got stripped. There was a lot of rain and it just totally disappeared. No, because it was so persistent and the neighbourhood knew who it was, and they were removed, they were vandalised, they were torn down about 6 or 7 times. So after the first time it was torn down, at that stage I actually had to get a planning permit to put it back up again. And these ones are about freedom of speech. And it was sort of like, you've got the right to say anything you like, according to Barnaby Joyce. And this person didn't get it and they ripped them down again. Oh yeah, this is Scott Morrison as Voltaire, who's the captain of freedom of speech. And what happened, I found it really upsetting because everybody was in lockdown and people could only walk 30 minutes apart, you know, at a time. And so it was something to do. So there was always very big crowds there. But you can see on the wall, see how it's been ripped down again? And it was definitely vandalised. And so I thought, what do I do about, I was getting really, I was genuinely upset. And I should know as somebody who makes work in the street that you can't always, what happens is what happens. But because so many people were contacting me and so committed to the project, I thought really long and hard about it, and I thought I'll apply the graffiti or the broken window principle in reverse. And that is, well, it's not really in reverse. That principle is if somebody's vandalising something, then you fix it immediately. So if windows are being broken, you fix the windows. If it's being graffiti, you paint it over. And so I wrote a note to the people and said, whenever this person or these people disrespect private property, art and freedom of speech, I will replace it. And I will paste up as many again. I will increase the number. And so by the time I finished, they had a couple more goes of it. I think I had something like 50 posters up, and they gave up. At that stage, I won. and the community won as well, because the community were right behind it. And the good thing about it was that I didn't have to get them printed out because I had the proof from my first walk. And so I just cut that out and stuck it up. But as I said, every time they written it down, I replaced the one that they wrote down and I put up another 10. And then I'm fortunate enough to have a very supportive publisher, and so the work has been made permanent, which is from my point of view, very important as ephemeral work, that it has a context to go into a library, because I think it's about 80 images that are in those books really plot that 3 years. That has been a really exceptional time, I think. And so, and the last thing I want to say is that was just the way I kept protest alive, and needless to say, engaged many other people in it. So thank you for listening to this funny presentation.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks for your patience with our microphones, but I certainly could hear you from where I was sitting. So I'd like to welcome all three of our speakers back to the stage for a short discussion. We've only probably got a few minutes for questions, but all three speakers will be sticking around afterwards, so you're very welcome to approach them and have an informal chat, ask them any questions that you might have individually. Thank you. Hopefully mine's working. I'm not sure. Yes, it is. So thanks again, everyone. I've got a couple of questions for you. Let's see how we go. So what does the concept of protest mean to you? I suppose as artists, as creators, as individuals that might be passionate about protest. Oh. Ali?
I guess in terms of protests, each person in the community has something to give. So as the gift that I hope to contribute in protest is through the storytelling, through our photography, and participating. I think in protest itself is participation. So I think that whether it's through amazing artworks like Julie's, everybody has a part to play in protest. So I think we sometimes forget that. So I think in terms of that definition, it's about participation and voice.
Thanks, Maylei. Ali, you look like you wanted to jump in there as well.
I guess it's interesting with regards, I've been involved in various protests as a documentarian and an activist for many years, and I think one of the two interesting things that came out of COVID, one was that the capacity to clamp down on protesting, and secondly, what we've seen over the years is, I don't know what the word would be, the laming out of protesting or the acceptance of particular ways of protesting, which are then kind of regulated through getting permissions from Melbourne City Council or designated spots for protesting, whereas protests really should be, in my view anyway, as more of a means of combating the state and taking on direct action. And so whilst I still think there's a voice and a necessity for particular types of so-called legal protests, and that is still a necessary facet of our public and civil rights and our civil life and our quest for social justice, that I'm a bit worried that over time that they'll become a little bit too legitimate in the eyes of the state and controlled, and that the initial kind of impetus of protest, which was to combat abhorrent injustices such as towards First Nations people with death in custody, such as refugee policy that locks people in prisons on faraway islands, like in a Guantanamo Bay style thing, is being lost. And so that's my reflections. I could talk about this for a long time, as you can tell, but I'll stop now. So thank you.
Clearly very, very passionate about that there. So did you want to add anything to that one, Julie?
I'd just like to add that I think that a creative energy and opportunities in actions for people to contribute really is at the heart of the best protests. What I did was all I could do at that particular time, but I do think that over the years protesting has become way more creative, and there's an expectation that there is that capacity to dress up or to create dramatic events as well, and so it's not only a protest, it's also a celebration of community and bonding, and it's the bonding that comes out of those moments where you feel like you really are in it together.
Do you think, obviously, all three of you are really passionate about social issues and protest as a movement and a way of, free speech and, I suppose, grassroots engagement? Do you think, as creative practitioners, it's essential for you to support and feel and, I suppose, and agree with what the protest is that you're documenting? I suppose, particularly from a photojournalist perspective, do you find if you're documenting something that you're really passionate and heartfelt for, it comes through in your work in a different way than if you were a journalist just documenting that movement?
I'll jump in. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not necessarily just about, am I passionate about something? Can I utilise my skills and privilege to give voice to something that may not have a voice in mainstream media, for example, or in government, or in places where people do have a voice to spew forth often some fairly abhorrent statements, as we've seen with Julie's work. So yes, I am passionate about that, but I'm more passionate, I'm equally as passionate about assisting people to elevate voices of lived experience just as much as the issue itself. And it just happens to be that often it is those people who may benefit from someone contributing skills from journalism or photography that happen to be the things I'm passionate about. So that's probably more the way that I would personally view it, but others might have a different perspective on that. So.
I agree, but I think also if you are involved or part of that community, you already have particular connection with people in that community, whether it's friends or colleagues or comrades in the marches and rallies. There is, I would say, quite a different engagement when you photograph them. I think there's how do I say? I've seen exhibitions before where people take more tourist shots of community, which is, there's a lacking of a certain essence. So I think when you are part of a particular community and you are engaged with people and they also know you well, I think there is a generosity of spirit that is captured.
And me, I don't photograph. But I can say that if something's right up my bum, as I said, then I think it works better.
I'm going to start incorporating that phrase into my own personal lexicon there, Julie. I guess this leads on to the next question as a bit of a follow-on, but do you think that through, and again it probably leans itself more towards the photography aspect, but do you think that documenting public demonstrations, whether that's through art forms, photography, writing, however that might be, is a form of protest in itself?
Can I answer that?
Of course you can.
Well, I think yes, because of social media, because many cause and concern gets enormous momentum through sharing, whether or not somebody's sharing an image that somebody else has taken. And one that comes to mind is the young boy in the boat off Malakuta in the fire, and then there was another one of the people on the beach. And that wasn't a protest though. I'm straying. My point, it's not quite on point, but my point still applies. A really powerful image, people will share it over and over again, but also then equally, everybody's a photographer in a protest, and so they're also sending it out there. So I think it has added to the power of events, no doubt. Indeed.
No, you're absolutely right, and I suppose it's that immediacy, isn't it, of photography as a media. Even if you're not a professional photographer, most of us have access to phone camera that you can immediately make, I suppose, your own personal protests through whatever platform you choose to use. That's very true. So I think that probably brings us to the end of tonight's discussion. So please join me in thanking our speakers, Maylei Hunt, Julie Shiels and Alistair Mckeech, for joining us tonight to talk about their work around protests. So just as a final wrap-up, this event is part of a quarterly series of programmes that aim to give you a glimpse of what we're collecting at the State Library and why. Our next Window on Collections event in August will be a National Science Week special highlighting women in science at the library. And you'll be able to find out more details about this via our website, which is slv.vic.gov.au. So thanks again very much for attending Windows on Collections protest, and we do hope you enjoy both exploring some of our protest-related collection items which are on display this evening, and also being able to speak to our speakers as well afterwards. So thank you very much.